Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our June session of the Microsoft 365 Meetup for Government. Want to thank everyone who could attend tonight, and for those who arrive after, we'll just be going through some brief introductions and then diving in with our speaker and presenter content. So for tonight, we'll be hearing from Matt Littleton, who's a global black belt with Microsoft, as well as from Tim Shinkle with Millican Associates about some of the work and case studies he's been doing with Microsoft 365 and records management in the federal government space. For those who are new to our group and community, our mission is to help inform, educate, promote networking and professional development with both practitioners, customers, and industry members within the Microsoft 365 and government public sector space. We have a few standards that should be common sense for everyone, so please be respectful and considerate. Please do not post any non-public, confidential, or other proprietary information. And while we certainly encourage folks to promote and share their both business or personal or professional promotion, keep it reasonable and not spam. We definitely want to reemphasize that this is a community event, so any of the views or information shared are the personal opinions of those presenting or sharing and do not reflect Microsoft, their respective organization. So we're here to all learn and grow, but this is not a official forum. I want to thank two of my co-collaborators, Andrew Kagan and Andy Oak from Planet Technologies, who help organize these events. If you're interested in helping to organize these events, feel free to reach out and get involved. For those who don't know me, I'm Nick Giard. I'm a program manager with the Office 365 Enterprise Cloud team in the government space. And for those who are not familiar with the Teams platform, the most important thing for you to know tonight is where the chat option is, which is the small kind of chat message box, voice box, like a comic book, as well as where the raise hand option is. So if you want to ask questions or bring up a topic, feel free to use either of those options to share with the group as we're keeping things moderated, just given the number of potential attendees. If you have content that you would like to share, we would love to potentially have you present at a future session. So feel free to use our call for content form to submit your presentation ideas. And this is very important, please take the time to provide feedback on tonight's sessions and the speakers. This not only helps us to continue to keep the content relevant and interesting for all of our community members, as well as it certainly helps our presenters to both continue to refine their presentation skills and know what was most resonant and interesting for the audience. So without further ado, I want to turn things over to our own Matt Littleton, who's going to be kicking us off tonight and with around the Microsoft 365 compliance story. Matt?
Excellent. Yep. Happy to be here. So Nick, I'll actually ask if you would monitor the chat window. I'm just going to go full screen with this for us.
Yep, so, we'll do. I'll be happy to come off mute if we have a question.
Yeah,
or
if you got something
else.
Fantastic. Love it. Just confirm everybody can see my slides.
We got you, Matt.
All right. Well, then let's power on to this thing. Just kind of a quick setup, like Nick talked about. Want to break out what the heck is a global black belt? How do I fit into the picture here? I'm really just the warm-up act for Tim, who's forgotten more about this subject area than many people will ever know. So I'm thrilled that he's on with us. I want to take the opportunity to kind of set that 50,000 foot view. What do we actually mean when we talk about information governance, records management from the Microsoft perspective? How does all this stuff fit together inside the platform? And then in that sort of education mode, I do want to take a couple minutes to really step through the principles of retention, the thing that makes all of this work. What's the logic inside Office 365 that's actually driving these actions? Because it is fundamental for everybody's success. And it, in my experience, sometimes isn't as well understood as maybe it needs to be, which can lead to some unintended outcomes for folks. And then, where do we find some of our, guidance? How do you figure some of these things out? We've got actually some exciting kind of announcements today. We actually went GA with a couple of things inside of the GCC environment specific to this subject. So global black belt really means I'm focused on all of our M365 compliance products. Spend a lot of my time working directly with our engineering groups. And then also an enormous amount of time is sort of the point of policy and technical escalation for field resources across the entire ecosystem of compliance product sets. I do have a specific remit to focus on our GCC, GCCI, DoD, and into the air-gapped environments. Come to this out of the military and the defense industrial base. And as Nick talked about, your feedback, I mean, both on this session and in general, on what we're doing, how we're doing, and why we're doing is really, really important. It's welcome, and it absolutely drives, what we're trying to develop in the places that we're seeking to take, the entire product stack. So when we say compliance, what are we talking about? I mean, this is the world that I live in and the areas that I focus on. And we kind of break this out into three main buckets of the information protection and governance segment. That's where we're going to spend our time tonight. Inside of risk management, our discover and respond pillar, all built on a foundation of our compliance management capabilities. So I've taken the liberty of throwing in some of the sort of the representative product and solution names underneath all of these to kind of get everybody aligned for where we are. I've also put in the link shortener for our compliance service description. That's the aka.ms compliance SD. Hugely important. We'll talk about that as we go through. This is where we seek to be transparent and fully, out there on all of the different, service descriptions and licensing requirements, and who benefits from what, and how do we actually do all of this. That invariably, becomes one of the questions whenever we're talking about this stuff. Is where does this live and what license, all the rest of that stuff. That's the Rosetta Stone for everybody to go look at that. So at this point, I want to pivot into kind of building out information governance, records management, and then we'll pivot into the principles of retention. If you've kind of seen me present on some of these things, we've got a similar kind of setup around information protection that we kind of go through our Microsoft information protection constellation, and we've kind of taken the liberty of trying to put some of this together for the information governance and records management perspective as well. The key point on this, and the reason it's just sitting right there in the middle of the screen, is that it's actually a service that is running, inside Office 365. And it's important to understand that there's, things that actually happen because of that, but it's a different way of processing on some of these things. Our vision for this is you're not actually having to physically move data around and manage from a records management or information governance perspective based on the location of a data. So it doesn't have to be in a particular place for some of these actions to apply. And that's why it's important to understand how that service works. So two kind of main areas when we go into this. I always want to put a plug in for Compliance Manager as a great capability, because it helps to align what's the requirements that you're actually addressing. So Compliance Manager in and of itself from a solution area, we'll leave to the side. Lots of great information about that and new things that are happening. Always kind of want to put it up because everybody operates inside of a framework. I'm trying to comply with NIST 853, or I've got an ISO standard I'm trying to comply with, or you name it, CMMC if you're kind of defense industrial base. All of those things. Compliance Manager is your lens to view through that particular set of requirements, and then decompose it down into actually actions. And some of those actions actually will live inside this information governance world. So when you do that, information governance is one of the two kind of core pillars that we're talking about here. And the point for this slide, and if you remember nothing else about what we're talking about right now, is our objective for you is to take action once and then apply it universally inside your environment, instead of trying to configure multiple different solutions in multiple different spots. So from an information governance perspective, this is the high level. What am I going to do with my information and the life cycle of information at a high level? So this is where you can actually start to create retention policies inside the platform. And before we go forward, a retention policy or action inside Office 365 can do three things. It can simply retain information. Say, I want this information to be held for 3 years and not allow anybody to actually have that data deleted from the environment. I want it there for eDiscovery purposes, legal perspective, you name it, whatever. So that's the retention. You can also have a retention policy that simply deletes data that is older than a certain period of time. Say, hey, I want everybody's email that's older than 3 years. We're going to set a policy, all of that gets deleted unless you do something with it. Or the third thing, you can have that combination. You can have a setup where you're going to retain something for a set period of time and then actually execute a deletion action on it. And from an information governance perspective, it is the platform that's actually doing that. So once you set up what your policies are for the environment, you've got the ability to then, in sort of one step, apply them universally across the entire tenant. And that's an important piece of that do it once perspective. The next level, if you will, of all of this takes us into an advanced capability, and that is the records management solution perspective from Microsoft here. So a couple things that actually come along with records management as a solution. First one is actually the file plan that you can set up for your environment. So this is where you would take something like the general record schedule, decompose it into actions that you're actually going to take and policies that you'll set up inside your environment, and then flow forward from there. The other really big deal with the records management bit is it actually brings forward the ability to do a disposition review. So under the information governance perspective, it's the platform in accordance with your policy that is actually taking actions on the data. If you want to put a human being into that chain, and you've got to have the ability to show disposition review, this is the solution that Microsoft has for that. We've got other capabilities in there as you move forward. In records management, you can actually set your retention label to also declare anything that is labeled with that particular label actually as a record, which brings higher fidelity controls around it. And then from that disposition review, the right-hand side of the screen here, couple of different things that you've got there. Sort of below the line, from a generic perspective, when you're setting up a retention action inside or a governance action, you can have that action apply from a couple of different perspectives. When was the information created? That's the thing that I'm going to actually key on. Or when was something last modified? So again, if I want to keep something for a year, do I keep it from a year from the date it was created, or the date of its last modification? Conversely, you can actually fire that off to be the thing that kicks that off is the date that you actually apply a label to a piece of information. And then above the dotted line, where you've got this event-based retention piece, which is a much more kind of complicated workflow that says, hey, when a program is over, I want something to actually happen. So there's a bit of setup work that needs to be done with that so that you set up that label taxonomy and structure to be looking for an event trigger. And then when that event actually occurs, you'll go in and fire that, and then your policies will actually take off. So governance, broadly applied, records management, much more detailed, granular on that, puts a human being into that review chain. And much like the information protection side from us, a lot of different factors from an automation perspective to build into the ability to give you the ability to set up auto classification and auto application of labels based on information types, keywords, sort of you name it. The next frontier on a lot of this is the trainable classifiers, ML models that are coming forward. And to that end, SharePoint syntax, again, coming into the government environments, but a big deal, from a SharePoint perspective, as a solution to reason over data and extract sort of meaning and understanding of what that data is all about. Because it's in the platform, we can actually leverage that knowledge to then take retention actions and governance actions on a basis of that understanding from syntax. And then the other thing that we popped up there in the upper right-hand side is the data connectors. So everything that I've talked about thus far is all about data that's organic to Office 365 created inside Office 365, but there's a ton of other information that you've got to provide governance actions for. And that's where our data connectors come in and allows you to bring data that is not created inside Office 365 into Office 365. So all of the compliance capabilities can action over that data. So from a governance perspective, from the information protection perspective, all of that comes into play. And the thing that's actually exciting today, Telemessage, one of the partners here, today we actually declared GA on a variety of the different external connectors for individual communication channels. And I'm going to jump out of the presentation real quick and just kind of share out on the docs page. You'll see today, these are the data connectors for all these things like SMS, text messaging, and all that have actually lit up inside our GCC environment. And we're phasing that into both GCC High, and DoD as we move forward. So it's an important capability, as I've talked to organizations, the ability to have the same logic applying to those individual communications of potential, senior officials is a really big deal. So we want to make sure that everybody kind of understands that. And then all of these solutions will inform other things that actually happen inside Office 365. And kind of across the bottom here is sort of the generic workflow and the sort of the Gartner Magic Quadrant bit with the enterprise information archiving, using those data connectors to bring data into Office 365 to reason over it, using all of the information governance capability that actually exists inside the platform for all of this, and then using other solutions that are informed by this, communication compliance, advanced eDiscovery, et cetera, is a really important kind of piece of the puzzle. There's one thing two things that have actually happened as well that I think everybody needs to be aware of. So on the slide here, we've got on the information governance perspective, the ability to do adaptive scopes. So you see I've got 4 blocks on information governance there. The adaptive scopes piece of this for this community is really important. That's going into a private preview and commercial right now. It's a limited private preview. It'll go to public preview in short order. And then we'll bring this capability forward into government environments. One of the key use case scenarios that we're thinking about with this, and is of big import for the government community, is things like capstone, officials and people moving around, and the ability to dynamically have those policies adapt and adjust. So we'll make additional noise. I'll continue to work with Nick and others to make sure that everybody kind of understands what's going on with that. But that's a capability that is certainly going to come. It is not yet released for anybody. The other one that we just did a webinar on was the multi-stage disposition review. Another one that I think is important for kind of a government entity and bodies in that records management disposition review process. Today, it's sort of a one and done. And as we move forward with this multi-stage disposition review, we're adding the capability to have several stages that you can actually send that disposition through to different individuals or different stages to make sure that you've got it covered for your organization. So that's the 50,000 foot overview. How does all of this stuff fit together, from a platform perspective? And that's kind of what we're talking about. And these are, Tim's the guy that makes all this real, and we'll move forward with that. I do want to jump into the principles of retention. Before we do that, any kind of questions that we need to address, Nick?
So far, nothing in the chat, but if anyone has something, now's a great time to raise your hand. Otherwise, we can, Matt, if you want to move forward.
Yeah, great. I just want to make sure I still wasn't just talking to myself, because I'm today doing this all off of one screen. So here's the big deal. This is back to that, hey, let's all learn together. Let's make sure that we're enabling each other. The principles of retention, how does this stuff actually work inside Office 365? And what are the decisions that are being made by the platform? Really, really important. And it gets confusing. So we've actually, taken the liberty of modifying some of our own sort of diagrams. This kind of 3-level layer cake you'll see on the docs.microsoft.com site. But we've added in some additional context here, and that's what I really want to kind of talk about. This is really this is a series of logic gates that are actually happening. I mean, so when the platform needs to make a governance decision, it's going to go through these in order, and if it can resolve the tie at the at a level, it doesn't proceed. There's no more logic that actually happens. And then it's also what part of this is actually being evaluated. So levels 1 and 2 are really focused on retention, and 3 and 4 are really focused on deletion. So the thing that's really important to understand is that retention is always going to win over deletion. Kind of period, full stop. And we'll unpack this. I've got a couple slides that actually have examples, because this is where it really becomes clear. If indeed we've got another layer that we need to evaluate, then between 2 retention policies, the longest retention is going to win. So we're not going to delete something if there's a retention policy or a label on it that says I'm still supposed to be dealing with this. And then if I've got a tie between, hey, I got 2 things that both say I got 2 policies in effect, just doing retention, the thing that says keep it for the longest period is going to win. Then we get into this the next bit, and that's all about the explicit over implicit. And this is where things get kind of tripped up. If we're into a deletion scenario, I've cleared all the retention on this, where there's no more logic that says I'm retaining this data, or I'm just going to kind of get rid of it. And I got 2 different things. I got to break a tie on who's going to delete what. This is where explicit will win over the implicit. So if there's a policy on something that's implicit, and I've got an explicitly labeled piece of information, it's that explicit action that's going to take the action. And then, finally, we're going to get rid of data as soon as we can. So the shortest deletion period wins. So let's make this real on this. So first one, this is back to that scenario of, what's my retention or my governance action going to be? I can either retain, or I can delete, or I can retain and delete. So this is just retention that we're talking about for this example. And the nuance here, example 1, is I've got a policy. So everything in that SharePoint site can be retained for 1 year. And then I've got a label that's applied just to 3 documents inside there. It says I'm going to retain it for 2 years, and then I'm going to delete on it. So then what's going to actually happen as we move forward on this for that life cycle? In that scenario, are 3 documents that are explicitly labeled. They're going to be, because they've got a retention period of 2 years, they'll stick around for 2 years, but everything else is going to get processed at the year, and then will be disposed and deleted. And that's back to the logic at the bottom. Those 3 label docs, that's the longest retention period, is the thing that's kind of breaking that tie on that. Everything else, it's the retention wins over deletion. Example 2, same kind of thing. You've got a retention policy for a year, and then delete. Then I've got a retention label applied to those 3 documents that says I want to retain it only for 6 months, and then delete it. So it's a shorter period of time than your policy. So what's going to happen? All the documents are going to be held for that year, because retention, is going to win out over deletion. So that's an important nuance, and where people kind of get sometimes tripped up on it. Even though I've explicitly labeled that retention for 6 months and then delete it, because I've got a policy that is a longer term and retention always wins over deletion, those documents are going to be held. Yeah. Now we kind of shift into let's talk about the deletion element of this. So this is where the language sometimes gets confusing as well. So it's a retention policy, but the only thing that's actually happening is I'm going to delete data. I'm not actually forcing it to be held. I'm just setting a clock saying I'm going to delete it. So example 3 there, SharePoint site, delete everything after a year. I put a label on 3 documents and say I'm going to delete after 6 months. what's the logic that's actually going to apply to that? In this scenario, we're going to get the three documents do get deleted after 6 months, and then everything else will be deleted after a year. And that the reason at the bottom there, those 3 documents, we get to that's the third stage, explicit winning over implicit. And then the other ones, it's shortest deletion, that's gonna action on those. Example 4, and then I got, one more kind of slide on this to make this real. Deletion of everything after a year. Then I've got another, put a label on those documents, say I'm now going to have a longer retention. I want to delete those after 2 years. So the 3 labeled documents are going to be deleted after the 2 years. So they will stick around longer. Everything else will get deleted after a year. And again, it's the same logic of that explicit winning over implicit. That breaks the tie for those 3 documents. And then everything else is in that shortest deletion period. And then from the just following on from an example 5 perspective, everything gets deleted in a SharePoint site, your policy after a year. Then I've got a label that says I just want to retain 3 documents for 2 years, then delete them. And in this scenario here, because we've got that combination again, those 3 documents, even though you've got a policy that says for 1 year, those would be retained for 2 years, then deleted. Everything else, that policy actions on it. Again, retention winning over deletion, then shortest deletion period winning. And then the final example, that we step through with this is the policy retain everything for a year and delete. Then I've got the retention label put on those 3 documents to say not keeping them from a shorter period of time, or not keeping from a longer period of time, keeping from a shorter period of time is what that label says. And in this scenario, again, you're going to have everything, including those 3 documents, would be kept for that year, because retention is going to win over deletion, and the longest retention policy wins. So that's the kind of a quick and dirty on that, but this is so fundamental to understand. And as you set up these policies inside the environment, the expectation, if you have a blanket policy that says I'm going to keep everything for a year in my environment, and if the expectation is, well, if I put a label on something that says I'm going to be able to get rid of it sooner, that is not going to be the case, because the retention winning over deletion. So I did want to spend some time on that. It's really, really important. Skip these in the interest of time, but it's a big deal for us. And I think, as Tim goes into his examples and all, we'll see some of that. A couple things just generically for government that I want to really land quickly here on some of these resources. One is the roadmap for us. From a compliance perspective, we're making a really hard, full court press to make sure that our government-specific compliance capabilities are indeed listed on our public roadmap. So you can filter it by the cloud instance that you're working on. I can't speak universally to this. There's a drive universally to get there. Certainly my world, the compliance world, we've really doubled down on this, and this is where you'll see the capabilities line up, when we get there. Put another plug in on that service description bit, the compliance service description. The generic, you'll see inside the main write-up all sorts of different language where we do explicitly call out government SKUs. Then we've also got over in the left-hand nav bar actually some specifics on each one of the government environments that have sort of a historical view of capabilities that are actually lined up inside the service. On the all-up compliance side, lots of great resources. I think these have all likely been shared before. We'll certainly share them out here again. Specific to the information governance bit, a bunch of shortened links here for us to get into information governance specific actions and items. And we just did and there was just a webinar that our product and business group did around that multi-stage disposition review and adaptive policies that was earlier this month. So those recordings are all out there. Lots of great stuff. That's really it from my end on that setup. If there are no sort of immediate questions that we need to address, I'm happy to stop presenting, which I'll do right now, and kind of turn the baton over to Tim.
Great, Matt. That was an excellent walkthrough. So yeah, please, folks, anyone who has questions, it's a great opportunity. Matt and I have played many games of Stump the Chump, and I've never stumped him. So, all right. Well, Tim, if you want to take it away, and then we can always circle back to any questions at the end. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And so good afternoon, good early evening to everybody. So I think what you saw there is a lot of capability. So when we first started exploring M365 a little while ago, we realized that Microsoft's put a lot of effort into providing a lot of robust functionality for compliance and records management. So what you'll see today is some of the lessons learned from that in my presentation as we implement solutions across the federal space. So just a quick background on Millican and Associates. We're an information governance and records management solutions company. Got our start in the nuclear power business, managing the records and information of a nuclear power plant. Experience over 30 years, hundreds of federal, state, local, and commercial customers. What makes us a little bit unique is we're subject matter experts in M365 and electronic records management / records management. What we have now in our company are a lot of people doing sort of hybrid roles. And I think traditionally especially in the federal market, we've seen in the past some gaps between the policy and IT and business. And so what we do is, as a company, is we help fill these gaps, and we have very specific solution providing consultants that can address both sides of the house. And that's something that we feel is pretty unique, and we've seen it play out quite well at some of our recent customers, including the case study I'm going to talk about today, which is Department of Energy. But we have a few customers now in the federal space currently, and just a small list that we're actively doing a lot of M365 work at. In fact, Department of Energy and DoD and Patent Trademark Office and others. So before I get more into the specifics of M365, just take a quick step back because we're focused on electronic records management, and we do appreciate all the connectors and things that are provided in M365 and the ability to obviously not just manage the information that is born within that environment, but also things that can get into that environment. But there often is a broader landscape that we have to look at for our customers. And so we've come up with sort of a very simple high-level framework that we apply to all of our customers. And the steps on the left-hand side sort of represent the flow on the right. And it usually starts with defining a simplified set of requirements for electronic records management. People might be familiar with the Universal Electronic Records Management requirements from NARA. That's become sort of a federal standard to review and look at, to understand, what features and functions do I need in my system to help manage the records that get into it. Once you've got that set for your organization, certainly you want to understand the landscape of where your records are across all your systems. You want to be able to prioritize them after that. And then it's critical to have sort of a component of the system development lifecycle for electronic records management. It's where cybersecurity plugs in, systems that are onboarded, systems that are going through major upgrades, systems that are being decommissioned, often are interacting with particular groups, gatekeepers, such as cybersecurity, and records management should also participate in that cycle and flow. And then once you've got a system set up, you certainly want to be able to monitor and maintain it, be able to audit it to make sure that you're doing the right things and it's fulfilling your needs. And then ultimately you have decommissioning. So all these things play into products like M365. So, and just quickly on the right-hand side, the thing in the middle there, when you have a system that has records in it, there's several things you can do. You can do nothing, which means the system is pretty much managing the records well enough on its own. You can enhance the system. That means maybe adding a module or configuring it more effectively. You can integrate that system where you can have a third party or another system manage those records for you. That's either through a transfer mechanism or through an in-place handshake through an API, or you can replace the system. So that's the framework at a high level. So the rest of the slides will cover how that framework plays out when dealing with products like M365. So there's a little preview or snapshot of the Universal Electronic Records Management requirements. So one of the things we did and what things we do with our customers is we take a look at what requirements they have, and often these will map to the Universal Electronic Records Management requirements, and then how do things in M365, Office 365 map to those specific requirements? So one of the exercises that we have spent in the past is going through every single one of these. There's about 40 or so of these requirements specific to a system, and then there are a number of requirements that are more service oriented. They're not system specific. But there are features now within M365 that can map and satisfy to various degrees of automation out of the box, all of those requirements. And that's sort of a critical piece and when you come up with your solution for electronic records management. So the case study I'll talk about today is Department of Energy. Some of you may have seen presentations in the past with myself and our customer Maria Levesque and Andrea Heimbrock over at Department of Energy. They've done a lot of work to get Microsoft M365 at a good place where it's managing the records within it. So at a high level, we've done a few things. On the left-hand side, upper left-hand side, one of the things that you do when you're implementing a solution for records management is make sure that you have the policy side up to date. That would include, what is our retention schedule? What are all the different record types in our organization, and how long do we keep them? Are they temporary or are they permanent? So that's a foundational component. And then for each business unit or group within your organization, often they only have a subset of that overall retention schedule that's applicable to their business processes. So that's typically called a file plan. So what's my file plan? Well, it's these 10 different record types out of the 300 that we have for our organization. Those are the ones that we produce in this business unit. So we have to adhere to the lifecycle retention rules of those specific record types within that file plan. So understanding that landscape of retention schedules, file plans is critical to the solution. In the centerpiece, M365, what is M365? Well, there's various apps within it. So it provides a lot of services, and some of those services are clearly bundled into what are called applications. So you have products like SharePoint Online, Teams, OneDrive, and Exchange. So Exchange is going to do your email. OneDrive is often used to replace the home drive. Teams is your collaborative workspace, sort of pulling all the bits and pieces together for projects and other collaborative needs. And SharePoint, we've found is starting to slowly but surely replace org shares or file shares, which leads us to the upper right corner of this slide, which is one of the strategies that we've deployed at Department of Energy is the approach to sort through all of the legacy file shares using some pretty robust third-party technology. We can crawl that stack of data, understand it better, categorize it, map it to the retention schedule, clean it up. You'll usually find sort of 3 states of data: stuff that's work in progress, stuff that's active records, and then inactive records. So and then, of course, expired records. So expired records, you want to clean up, you want to get rid of the trash, reduce your storage overhead costs. And then you want to slowly but surely take things that are active that you can put into a more controlled workspace that people are working on in M365. So that's sort of a key component to our overall strategy in the DOE case study. I'm going to walk through some of the constraints that we've come across, and these are really over the years, but also specific to DOE. One of the constraints of implementing electronic records management is that we're always trying to sort of minimize the end user involvement in filing and managing records. So what does that mean? Well, people in their use of these products in their daily work routine are fulfilling, the mission of the organization. They're working within a business process. Their main task or job is not to file records. It's to, process purchase orders. It's to support, regulations that manage, the airline industry, whatever it might be. Their main mission usually isn't to do records management. So when you start asking folks at the end of the day who have produced or worked with, tens or hundreds of different documents on the go, hey, could you file those now, or could you look at them and classify them as a specific record type? And here's a retention schedule full of, hundreds of record types. Pick the one out that maps. You usually don't get good results from that. So, the constraint for us is how do we minimize that? How do we make that invisible and use things like inheritance and auto classification and policies in the background so records management is happening automatically? The next constraint there is maximizing your investment. So at DOE, it's very critical that, they put a lot of money into this product. They, it's used widely and broadly across the organization. So we want to manage the records that go into it. We want to leverage the features and functions that come with it. We want to optimize the storage within it. We're replacing the org shares so we can, provide a richer experience with search and it persists, as people come and go, and you have the ability to apply more controls to that information. And of course, OneDrive's slowly but surely replacing the home drive, providing again more capabilities and features and functions. Other constraints, minimize the use of custom development. So we're using as much as we can out of the box. And so we appreciate looking at roadmaps that Matt showed earlier, where things are going. We have to keep an eye on all the great new features that are coming out in M365 to help manage electronic records. In the case of DOE, there are some third parties that we did use. People may have heard of AvePoint. That provides us an ability to do some auto site provisioning, and that's helpful for us where we configure workspaces, sites, teams, SharePoint sites. We auto configure them when they're requested, so they come with the records management configurations we want those things to have automatically. So that helps us bake records management into that whole process. And then we have a third-party technology, Tier 5 data tool called Seek, and that helps us clean up the file shares, does auto classification across millions of documents, and helps us move that into the controlled repository of M365. Another big constraint, minimize the level of effort to implement, maintain, and support. So the goal there is often organizations don't have a lot of money to spend on electronic records management. They're budget constrained. There are mandates, federal mandates, Federal Records Act, M1218, M1921. It's kind of changed a little bit, but these are, OMB, NARA standards that have come out, but they're unfunded. So it's saying that you have to manage your records and, you have large volumes, but you're going to have to do it with the budgets you have. And so what we're always looking to do is, how can we do this as automated as possible? So at Department of Energy, we have things like playbooks where there are multiple tenants. For M365, we can provide, guidelines and standards and support various customers across the organization. Leveraging existing retention schedules for ERM. So I'd mentioned earlier, what a retention schedule is. There are sort of our two types. There's the general retention schedules that NARA publish for all federal agencies. And then there are the typical records disposition schedules that have sort of organically grown over time within each organization that support the mission. They're mission-specific types of retention schedules for the things that are uniquely done by that organization. And potentially there are thousands of these types. So what types of records get into M365? Well, probably just about any of the types that you're going to find in the retention schedule, which makes it a hard problem. So it's not, hey, could we come up with one blanket policy for all of our OneDrives and and SharePoint environments and Teams and covers all of our records and we're done. It's much more nuanced. It's much richer problem set with the different thousands of different record types. But within those, if you look at the disposition instructions, the retention rules that govern those types, there are often, dozens, maybe 50 to 100 within, several thousand record types for some of the larger organizations. And what that means is we can come up with good strategies for how we can reduce the number of retention labels we have to make. We can reduce the number of auto-apply policies we have to make in M365, and we can, genericize and share instances of these rules across all of those record types. So there's a way to, if you're clever about it, minimize the level of effort and support that's required in that solution. And then finally, a lot of organizations, or some of them, struggle with, how do we open up these privileged roles that we find in the compliance? And, Microsoft's done a good job, I think, responding to those needs with the ability to segregate access to content with a privileged role that has, high level capabilities, can perform eDiscovery, can perform records dispositions. But there are still some, things that you need to be aware of. So what we do is we try to minimize those roles, and we have sort of centralized control from an automation perspective, but distributed as a distributed solution from a management and process of the ownership of those records. So that's one thing that we spent a lot of time doing with those privilege roles, and instead of opening up the gamut and giving everybody access as a records manager to the compliance center, we put some constraints around that. So at a high level, the different applications that you're going to find in M365, this is a quick picture of sort of, through the tiers, what you're going to find. Teams is an interesting collaborative workspace on top. I say interesting because it's got bits and pieces of where things are stored underneath in the other apps. So, if you have personal group chats or Teams channel conversations, they're going to go into different areas, and Exchange Online is actually where they're stored. Now, the user of Teams is unaware. They don't have to be aware of where that stuff is being stored. They're just going into a Teams channel, having a collaborative experience there, getting their job done. But from a governance perspective, you have to be aware of, where is that data being stored? So when I create those policies on the bottom and those retention labels and apply them, how do I get nuanced around those different areas where that information is stored? And so this map sort of helps us understand that. So OneDrive, and then on the right-hand side, Teams channel files and conversations go into sort of different types of SharePoint sites. You have your group connected SharePoint sites and your sort of traditional SharePoint sites that are not specifically group connected. And there are some nuances to be aware of between those different flavors of SharePoint. And then the bottom, we have security and compliance, or now it's called the compliance area of M365, allowing us to create policies and labels and applying retention rules that map back to the retention schedule to that information. And it's very important what Matt brought up earlier about the implicit, explicit, and the hierarchy of policies, retaining versus deleting. We got tripped up on that earlier in the process as well, where we were hoping we could do blanket policies of, keep everything for 7 years, but then I could explicitly apply a label and get rid of it sooner. That's not the case if you're going to do retains. You just have to be careful how you do that and how you apply those things, and map them out often, in a test tenant to make sure it works the way you'd expect it to work, and then you can roll it out in production. Roles and responsibilities, always a big issue and something that has to be mapped out and well thought out. So this is sort of a high level flow from the left-hand side to the right. During the early stages, we have some roles and responsibility for folks to take retention schedules and convert them into the format that we apply and configure in a M365. So there's sort of 3 outcomes from a retention schedule mapping exercise. We have terms that we're using in a term store. So when things go into SharePoint, we can get that nuanced term to apply to the appropriate records record. And we have retention labels that we have to map from that retention schedule, and we have auto apply policies. And so those 3 artifacts. And then each of those artifacts gets fed into some of the components of M365, a unique component. We have things that go into the term store and for SharePoint, where SharePoint is sort of our main repository in M365. Records from Teams and OneDrive and other things may get produced in those areas, but eventually move their way into the SharePoint environment. So that's where we're using the term store. In the middle, we have the retention labels that get set up in the compliance area of M365, and then we have auto apply policies. Once those are set up, we have configuration of SharePoint sites. So there's some configuration during that provisioning process. And then as people move content into those environments, they're going to be finalizing information, closing projects they're working on. We have auto apply policies running in the background that will then apply the appropriate retention label to those records. And then ultimately those records start to expire and we go through a disposition process. So we generate disposition reports. We have a little workflow associated with that. We have a disposition approval process where all the customers of the organization look at the records that they own. There's usually a liaison working with the records folks in the policy side, that a liaison for each business unit that reviews what records have expired for their group, and then approves that. And then there's a disposition sort of execution that happens where things are either deleted or transferred to National Archives or to a longer term archive. And that works in conjunction with any holds that might be in place. So if something's on hold, clearly it's not going to go anywhere for the time being. But once that hold is lifted, that stuff can then be, follow its normal life cycle. And ultimately, there's a report that's generated that shows you that what things have been disposed over time, and gives you a little record of compliance. So this is sort of a breakdown of those roles. On the left-hand side, at the top, we have sort of the business users. What are their responsibilities in that process? I flip back to that process for a sec there. Creating projects, moving documents into M365. That's the number 4 in the middle. We have records officers, managers, records liaisons. They're plugging into sort of steps 1, 3, 6, and 7. So if you go back here, like 1, they're helping with the retention schedules. 3, they're helping with configuration of sites, answering any questions that people may have, and making sure that sites are configured properly, workspaces. Excuse me. We have 6 and 7 involved. 6 is doing the disposition approval process, and 7 is helping, get that execution finally done. Then we have things like site owners. They have responsibility for making sure that their site collections, subsites, their team environments are running properly. The configurations are done properly within those. And then the roles in the bottom are sort of centralized roles. Folks in the IT RM hybrid area where they're performing additional activities around supporting how sites are configured in the auto site provisioning process. They're supporting the disposition review process by interacting with the out-of-the-box components that come with M365 for running a disposition process and getting things into the workflow. And then ultimately configuration, making sure things are configured correctly in the back end. So this is a robust chart, I would say, how we do the mapping of retention schedules. On the left-hand side in the first column, these are typically the patterns you're going to find in a general retention schedule or your organization's records disposition schedule. And those patterns will show you things like it's a transfer or destroy after X years, months, days after some kind of event, or it's permanent transfer to NARA after some years, X days, or some kind of event. The events can be multi-conditional. The events can have things like cutoffs. They can be things like when case closes, when no longer needed, when things are obsolete. So what we do is we genericize these disposition instructions into also a label naming convention. So we have things like temporary delete X years after event, or temporary delete X years event calendar year. So CY is calendar year for cutoff, and that tells the system and the user of the system who perform the disposition process that, oh, these things just get run once a year. So there's a rounding for that calendar year. So we'd run that disposition every January of every year. If it's fiscal year, we'd run it every October of every year. So there are things like that. So there's a standard approach that we've set up for how labels get created and how auto apply policies are named and get implemented. And then the other benefit here is, with this mapping, we know exactly what query to use within our auto apply policy. And then we have some exceptions on the right-hand side where, things can sometimes get tricky. We have an 80-20 rule where some exceptions might cause us to do some additional workflow capabilities. But in general, we can automate much of that retention schedule in M365 following these standards. This is just a little example. I took some screenshots. There's a retention label that we've made. Here's an auto apply policy that we've created. So it's following the naming convention. And then here's an example of their term store. And these are just really just classification terms that get applied to documents that get put into the SharePoint Online environment. And so we do that through an inheritance model. So automatically these things are inheriting these tags, and that tells the policy what to look for to apply the appropriate labels. So in the sort of final snapshot here, here's an example of a generic SharePoint site. Documents have been dropped into the system development document library. They inherit automatically that term that has to do with system development documents. There's a specific GRS schedule for that. And then once people are done with that content, or based on how you've configured it, the policy will come along and auto apply that label. So that sort of puts all the pieces together. So unbeknownst to the business user, they're just working on the documents, sharing them, collaborating on them. But at some point, labels get applied through a service, and then they expire over time. And then sort of last slide, just talking about a future state here. Some of our challenge is to deal with certain systems that may not connect well to M365, or some of the retention schedules in M365. Certainly places like Department of Energy can be 250 years, 1,000 years, which obviously is many lifetimes. So as that information becomes very inactive, it still has to be kept. So there is an opportunity for us to build sort of a cloud archive. And what we're looking at here is a strategy for us to move large database-based systems at scale into an Azure environment for long-term record storage that may not go or fit well into M365, or M365 itself might be a customer to the cloud archive in Azure. So these are things that we're sort of building now for some of our customers and proposing to other prospects in the federal space for how they can do sort of very large scale, long-term cloud archiving of electronic records that are inactive, put into much cheaper storage. When you clean things up, you might have a cloud recycle bin that persists data for some period of time before it's ultimately deleted. And this is sort of a snapshot of that approach. And that's it on my end. So I think what I'll do is turn it back over and open it up to questions. Here's my contact information. If anybody wants to reach out to me, you can take my email or just give me a call. And with that, I think I will stop sharing my screen. And turn it back over to Nick.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. That was a fantastic case study. So Do we have any questions from the audience? I didn't see anything in the chat, but I'm going to actually allow folks to unmute. So anyone who wants to ask questions or add to the discussion, please come off mute and chime in.
Yes, this is Miguel Wood. I do have a couple questions. Actually, one specifically, although it's still in preview regarding Azure Purview. I know that most of the information we've been talking about has been around Office 365, but as we start now having the ability to use the labels created in the SEC, in Office 365 SEC, and actually be able to start tagging or classifying and actually applying those labels to data in other data sources, specifically Data Lake and even SQL Server, both on-prem and in SQL database, and arguably probably in even other cloud environments. What I know it's still in preview. Will we see some of those policies that we set up in SEC be able to be applicable to some of those data sources as well once they've been applied in the other sources?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if that's a question for me or not. Nick, you might want to jump in, but so we have, as a partner, looked at Purview as well. In that last slide I was showing, I think that might be what you're referring to. And so it's pretty exciting for us to look at technology like that in terms of how can we solve electronic records management at a much larger scale. So I think, Microsoft's going to have to tell you exactly where they are with those things and the details of exactly how they work. But we've had the same sort of discussion on our side around doing exactly the things you just mentioned there, inventorying other systems out there, being able to get a jump on the classification of that information and how do you apply policies early in the process so that they're inherited throughout the life cycle of that information. Data Factory was another one that I think plugs into Purview, and it's early for us looking at that technology, so I don't have any answers that go beyond sort of what your question is from my end, but Nick and others might want to provide some further insight.
Yeah, that might be a great question, Miguel. That might be a good one for Matt. Do you want to address that? If not, I can speak to it a little bit.
Yeah, we've got a couple of different things there. I mean, the intent with Purview, certainly as we start out here with the information protection side on it, is exactly as you kind of laid out. That's it. We're all about take action once, and then extend it out across the board. I want to make sure I get the sort of the root of the question is that I think you're seeking to do the same thing on the information governance side as we're doing on the information protection side. Is that
that's exactly where
statement?
That is correct. Yeah. So again, the idea is we obviously have third-party tools, but then that obviously takes us to multiple panes of glass and multiple management systems administration as well. So obviously one of the good things about Purview is being able to manage it no matter where it resides. To I think Nick's and or Tim's comment, obviously Purview also provides that to the ADF, allows for us to see where that data is coming from, but be able to going all the way back to say a database column and having it be tagged, and then actually the policies, the governance policies around that. Because as soon as I start able to take care of the labels, and I have the ability to start governing even that data at that, no matter where it resides, right? So, I mean, I off the top of my head, I'm thinking, hey, I've got the ability to go ahead and not only take a look at, now I've got all my Office 365 sources. I've got my database, all my database sources now in whatever cloud it may be, or even on-prem, and even going down that data lake perspective, where I may have a lot of non-structured data as well, and then hopefully eventually be able to have the policies in place to manage that as well, from a governance as well as restriction, or RMS, if you will.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, so key scenario at outset here is definitely that protection element on it, and don't have anything. I mean, unless there's something, Nick, on your side, on the management side, certainly take the feedback. An area of discussion for us holistically from the Microsoft perspective. I mean, and part of, I guess, the meetup here, kind of function on this is this perception, that, well, I've got a label, and labels are all sort of the same thing. A sensitivity label or a retention label, those are radically sort of different things with different solutions and different logic applied to them, despite the fact that it's the same term. So multiple different teams involved on it. I mean, the ones that are certainly in the lead right now are and what we're focused on is that information protection. But we'll certainly take the feedback on it, and we can funnel back through Nick if we've got some additional, hey, here's governance stuff that we're actually going to do with that.
Absolutely.
But I love it. I mean, it's a fantastic
that's
question and approach. I mean, but it's
a great point, Matt. And I think, while I'm not aware off the top of my head off of any specific plans around what you mentioned, though, it is worth thinking through that. If you look at things like the types of sensitivity labels and how that can be extended through, whether it be through Purview or other tools, I mean, there is a whole, API, SDK, and then even metadata that's potentially part of that, right? So when we look at things like retention labels, those are really a mechanism for application of policy within Microsoft 365 and how it stores data. And there's places where, where that framework seems to be continuing to extend. But same thing's true, right? If I have a database or a system, some of the stuff that Tim mentioned, where there's large scale data platforms across multiple systems being built. Again, if I have, labels or some sort of way of interfacing with that data, then the application developer or system owner can key off of that to enforce whatever policies are appropriate. So it's not necessarily part of the framework that's the current approach, but it does provide a mechanism that could be leveraged. I mean, an application developer could build whatever capabilities leveraging that pattern.
Great, thanks. Appreciate it.
Anyone else? Any other thoughts, questions? Tim, one question I had for you with some of the work that you were talking through doing is I know sometimes it seemed one of the biggest challenges within large organizations is not just the implementation of the technology, but it's really the coordination, the education, the data gathering of some of the different stakeholders or data owners across the organization, right? Like even just identifying who those data custodians are, what schedules, and getting all of that data to then put policies in place. Do you have any kind of experiences or learned how kind of you guys tackled that? And was there anything that was helpful to use? I mean, I've seen a couple of cases anecdotally where people were using other Microsoft 365 tools and capabilities to help with some of that data gathering to then, just as like, say something like forms or lists, but how did you guys approach that?
So that's a great question. So yes, there is a very traditional business process on the records management policy side to establish liaisons across all major business units, and then correspond with them periodically to get inventories done and to update understanding of what systems they have, what records they have in what systems, what their retention schedule file plans are. And we've seen recently some of that work even at some of our customers now using Power Automate, Power Apps to use the form capability within there to automate that process. So we're excited about that. We've done things in Microsoft Access in the past to track and manage. And we think the next generation of that solution will be in the Power Automate platform. So we're looking forward to that.
Okay, great. No, thanks. Appreciate the insight. Well, if there's no other questions or commentary that anyone wants to have, we'll wrap up here for the evening. So just a reminder, please take the time to fill out the feedback form, especially if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for Matt and Tim or for this community. So thank you everyone very much for attending this evening, and we'll be posting the recording of this later this evening or tomorrow. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.